Today we see about Trifles written by Susan Glaspell. First we see about author introduction. She was an American playwright, novelist, journalist and actress. Then she was born in 1876. She was the founder of the Provincetown Players along with her husband George Van. It was the first modern American writer theatre company. Her famous works Alison House and Trifles. She won Pulitzer Prize for drama in 1931. She was died in 1948. Next we see about Trifles introduction. Trifles is one act play. It is the story of murder mystery. It was the first performed by the Provincetown Players at the Wharf Theatre in Provincetown, Massachusetts. It was staged on August 8, 1916. Next, we see about the characters. The main characters. These are all main characters. First character is George Henderson. He is a country attorney. Next character, Henry Peters. He is a sheriff. And then third character, Mr. Peters. She is a sheriff's wife. And then fourth character, Lewis Hay. She is a neighbor's farmer. And then fourth character, Mrs. Hay. Mr. Hay's wife, Mrs. Hay. Next character, John Wright. She is murderer. Next character, Mrs. Wright, his wife, John Wright wife. Next we see about the play's setting. The play's setting is John Wright farmhouse. The farmhouse name is Trifles. So Trifles meaning the farmhouse name is Trifles. Then gloomy place, road cannot be seen. This is the play setting. Next about the play Trifles. The story's motive is to real the murder John Wright. The character suspect whether murder must be committed his wife someone else. The main character doubt Mrs. Wright. So they focuses to search evidence in the kitchen. Next we see about story starts. The story begins in the farmhouse of John Wright. The kitchen appears to be messy. Messy means dirty. The country attorney, sheriff and Mrs. Hale enter to the house. They are followed by Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. The woman stands at the door. They do not join when hear the fire warm them. Next, the country attorney makes whether nothing touched in the house. Next, he begins investigate Mr. Hale by asking him to events the previous. Next, we see about Mr. Hale finds the death of Mrs. Wright. Mr. Hale replies that he visited Mr. Wright's house to keep asked about getting a telephone fire. Mrs. Wright was sitting a rocker moving back for she had an anytime wear apron hand and was nervously pleating it. Next, he found wife behaved strangely. She said that her husband went upstairs with a rope around his neck. Then she said that someone staged her husband when she was asleep. Next we see about Henry Peters comes to help Mr. Hale. Henry Peters comes to help Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale brings to Sheriff Henry Peters. See the dead Mr. Wright Peters. Next, Henry goes to bring the coroner. Coroner means suspicious death and inquest into violent official's death. So, that is coroner. Next, when Mr. Hale tells her about the telephone, she laughs, then he looks scared. Next, we see about George Henderson investigates in the kitchen. The glass jar of fruit preservative is broken because of cold. Next, it has made a cupboard messy. Mr. Hale says that the woman worried over the Trifles. Next, we see about Henderson criticizes to Mrs. Wright. Next, Mrs. Hale supports to Mrs. Wright. dirty towels in the kitchen, poor housekeeping skills in the kitchen. The place was gloomy, but she not visited for a year. Mrs. Wright to be blamed. Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale and Mrs. Peter gathering things for Mrs. Wright. Henderson allows Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters to gather few belonging to for Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Hayes arranges the pan in the kitchen, disturbed by the maid. She does not like men criticizing the woman. They take clothes for Mrs. Wright from her closest. Next, we see about Mrs. Hale, about Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Hale, about Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Hale remembers Mr. Minnie Wright. So, Mrs. Wright's full name is Mrs. Minnie Wright. As an unmarried Minnie Foster, she was very happy life. Mrs. Wright, unmarried life is very happy life, and she used to sing beautifully, and then she was not cheerful after her marriage. She was now asked only for her apron and shawl. She is worried about her food perspective. Next, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peter about the murder. Mrs. Peter says that her husband suspect. How could a wife not wake up during a murder? Mrs. Hale mentions that her husband found a gun in the house. It's suspicious to use a rope of murder instead of a gun. Next we see about Mrs. Peters find a large sewing basket. Its bright pieces she was piecing a quilt. She was following log cabin pattern in which the fabric is pieced around a center square. Next, the men go to bond in the search of evidence. Bond means the foremost means bond. They laugh listening to the woman discussion about the blanket in the quieted or knotted, dismiss the trifle. Next, Mrs. Hale observes strange things. Half of the dish towel is clean, loaf of bread outside the bread box, unfinished quilt. One block of the quilt is made untidily than the other stitches. Show us nervousness. Next, Mrs. Peters looks in the cupboard to find paper and still complete the quilt. But instead find a bird cage. There was no bird. Hale remembered a man who sold canary. Maybe cat has got it. Mrs. Wright did not have a cat. She was upset when Mrs. Cat went into her room. The door of the cage was broken. Next, Mrs. Hale says about Mrs. Wright, she was kind like bird herself, sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. Timid means one of the beautiful, sweet, kind, etc. But she has changed after the marriage. Next, Mrs. Hale finds a pretty red box in the sewing basket, searches a scissors in it, surprised to find the dead bird wrapped in a silk cloth. Horrified to see that neck is wrung. Men enter from the barn. So barn means already I told, barn means farmhouse. The woman hide the box among the quiet pieces. Mr. Henderson ridicules them, asking whether the blanket is to be quieted or knotted. Mrs. Peters answered dismissively that Mrs. Wright must have planned to knot it. Next, the men find no evidence into the barn. So the rope is from Wright's home itself. The men go upstairs to analyze the rope inch by inch. Next, women have new understanding about Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Hale says Mrs. Wright was trying to bury the bird that she loved the pretty box. Mrs. Peters remembers her childhood days when a boy killed her kitten in a catch. She was curious about the boy, but she was not allowed to do so. Next, Mrs. Peters shares the stillness when her first baby died, 2 years old. However, she feels the law has to punish Mrs. Wright from the crime, killing her husband. This is the story. Next, this is the Trifles story. Next, the theme of this play, male domination, isolation, loss of identity, revenge of violence, freedom of rebellion, feminism. These are all themes of the play. Next, this play is used to symbols. So, for preserves means femininity. So, these symbols used this Trifles play. Rope means revenge, quiet, physic instability, bird cage restrictions, bird freedom, notching the quiet, killing her husband. The final title of the play is ironic. Mr. K and Mr. Peter's conversations are considered as a trifle. The irony is that one discover the true motive of the murder. Thank you.